So following on from our previous topic of requirements management, I just wanted to delve a little further into the business analysis discipline, which is extremely complementary to the TOGAF framework around how we elicit requirements and where the business analysis community can help and support that ADM cycle. So let's take a closer look at where business analysis and the role of business analysis fits into the architecture space. So if you recall, we spoke about how we design a business model. And that was broken up into three sections. We had a market model. We then had a products and a services model. And down the bottom here, we had an operating model. Now, all of these pieces working in synergy results in what is referred to as a cohesive business. In other words, a business that works together as one synergistic solution. And the job of enterprise architecture is to get them all to work in that fashion. However, there's a challenge. Sitting at the top here, all right, you have ownership of that piece, normally sitting at the C-level, the chief marketing officer, branding, those types of pieces, the CEO. Down here in the products and services, you have the product management function or product manufacturing function, and that often has strong ownership as well. Down here in this space here, and specifically dealing with things like information architecture, application architecture, those things, you may have the CIO, which is the Chief Information Officer, who has ownership of that. Now, the challenge comes in actual fact, there's a gap that sits over here, in that ownership of the business architecture discipline, all right, is quite weak, especially if you look in large-scale organizations. So then, those commercial types of organizations are only just getting to grips with it. And similarly over here, the discipline which kind of bolts all of these pieces together so that they actually have an element of cohesion, that part of the discipline is also missing. That's an architectural discipline, right? And sometimes we refer to those as business architects. Well, what a lot of the community is asking is, well, what is the actual difference between this concept of a business architect versus a business analyst? So the best way to try and explain the different roles of the business analyst and the business architect, right? Predominantly, if we're just reiterating with the ADM, remember we're saying the business analyst spends a lot of time on requirements management and helping us through that whole cycle, right? But also remember, we produced around this quadrant graph in which we had strategic value versus complexity. And if you recall this top right hand quadrant, we had tactics, which would be around product development, redevelopment, redesign, process redesign, those things. Down in this space here, you had improvement of processes, optimization, those types of techniques. Down here, you would have had automation, putting it into a piece of technology. That would be highly transactional or consistent processes that are repeatable. And over here, you might decide to outsource this. That's normally the outsource quadrant. Now, when it comes to the different roles, up here in this space, or predominantly on this side, which is the high strategic value, is normally, right, the business architecture discipline. And sitting on this side, which is a lot to do with delivery and automation of highly repeatable processes and managing outsource agreements, is often the business analysis discipline. However, when looking at the various roles defined across these two disciplines, sitting in this place here, you can merge what's referred to as the strategic business analyst, right, with a strategic business architect. So those are the two different types of roles. So there's a lot of strategic business architecture type work that occurs up at the top here as you begin to understand the business and elicit requirements up at a strategic level. So those are the types of roles that you would need there. Then as you kind of move down and have an understanding, you document processes, now you're getting into the improvement space and you're beginning to use probably a principal business architect or a senior business analyst that might be able to help you with those techniques here. Eventually, when you have a clear understanding of processes that need improvement and optimization, you can get to a level of maturity in which you begin to automate it and push it out into the automation space. And that's often where the business architect begins to relinquish a lot of the control, but a lot of the business analysts, the intermediate business analysts, some of the junior business analysts would kind of sit within this space here. Till ultimately you're going to take bits of technology and you might decide to outsource it, or processes, and you might decide to outsource those. So those are really talking about some with a career path, and you can see as one of the additional resources that we've added. There's a career path diagram there which shows you the career paths that the business architect and the business analyst need to travel. So you can kind of get a view of, well, how do they fit into, how do these two disciplines fit into one another and actually provide not a competitive discipline, but they're actually symbiotic, and then they support each other quite nicely. So just building a little bit on from the business architecture and business analysis disciplines. Just to summarize, we spoke about some frameworks. So really what you have is one of the additional resources I've included for you is referring to these three frameworks or body of knowledge. So have a closer look at that and you can kind of get an idea of where their strengths and weaknesses lie. So BizBoc, which is the business architecture body of knowledge, BABOC, which is the business analysis body of knowledge, and TOGAF. And I've elaborated in a previous topic around the difference between the body of knowledge and framework view of things. So really what you want to do is you want to try and stitch these pieces together within a framework. And we've introduced TOGAF as a meta framework. It's a glue that links a variety of different areas together. So, well, what will that look like? So once again, let's look at our ADM and kind of see, well, where could those frameworks actually provide value along the way? So remembering that TOGAF glues it all together. So let me just scoot through that quickly. Right, so really what you have is really within this context iteration or architecture capability iteration, that's really where the business architecture piece comes in. But it's a lot to do with understanding strategy and business motivation. And really in that space you wear your business hat on. In other words, how can I re-engineer the business? And you develop artifacts that are closely aligned with business thinking. So for example, something like a business motivation model, which we introduced in one of the previous topics. Now that business motivation model, you'll have business people that will look at that and think, wow, this is gold, I really love this, and they'll walk around with it under their arm. You give that artifact to an architect, he's going to think, oh, this is so simple, oh, give me some more detail. So there's once again a classic case of the different sort of views and viewpoints. But up at that level is really the business architecture space. And in order to elicit requirements that would help you drive out that strategy, you're sitting in the middle here, and there's a requirements management, and you're going to use the business analysis discipline to help you kind of link these two pieces together. So it makes a fairly good team. You're worrying about, a business architect is worrying about structuring and mixing stuff together. The business analyst is often out there eliciting those requirements from the actual business on the ground in the trenches, so to speak. And that's often where the likes of the business analysis body of knowledge could support them in that task. Now, when you move into the architecture development iteration, which is kind of this piece which sits around here, predominantly these three, you, as an architect or a business architect, your hat has to change. So now you're no longer looking at business language or business motivation model. This is where we start to address things like, if you recall, the business anchor model and the logical application model and the data model, logical data model, those pieces. And that's more an architectural language that you're beginning to use. And these tools and techniques are TOGAF-based tools and techniques. But you can also, within the business architecture phase, you can also leverage the business architecture body of knowledge to help you support some of the detailed content, what some of those artifacts might actually look like. So it's important to have an understanding. Remember, these are tools in your toolbox. And your job as an architect is to decide which tool to use to help you solve business problems. What makes a good architect is the ability to assemble and mix stuff together correctly. So just to summarize this module, we've actually had a look at what's referred to as the transition phase and the governance iteration. So the transition iteration and the governance iterations, which is kind of the left-hand side of the ADM, sort of all around this spin here, looking at how we plan the implementation of our architecture. Now, in Module 4, we're going to be taking a closer look at activities that would occur in the preliminary phase. And that's really around, well, how do I build an architectural capability? How do I build a practice of architecture? What makes a good architectural practice that produces good outcomes versus a bad one that results in multi-million-dollar failures? So we're going to take a closer look at that and understand what are the keys to success are within that particular module.